What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel and another Outriders video. Now, I've been trying to make Scorched Zealot Pyro work for a while, and while the firepower side, which essentially this is what it is, it's a firepower set, so you're using volcanic rounds and you're dealing damage like that, was working reasonably well. The star of the build, this sort of projectile, this Hadouken that you would essentially shoot out due to the set bonus, just wasn't dealing enough damage according to me. And while I was messing around with mods and different skills and everything like that, and really just trying to get it up to the highest level possible, lo and behold, Jinx13, a member of the Discord community and just an all-around badass, actually highlighted his version of the build, which had specifically targeted some of the melee mods that are present in the game, things like brawl and martial arts, concussive force. So these mods, which were all mods that empowered your melee, he had incorporated those into his build. Now, this is something I would have never considered, that this would actually strengthen that projectile. And obviously, I would imagine that this was the idea that PCF tried to bake into this set. So definitely those mods actually increase the effective power of that projectile. And once I slotted those in, boy oh boy, did this build explode. So as said, absolutely a huge shout out to Jinx for their suggestion of bringing these mods in. Hadouken! This has essentially elevated this firepower build to something that I think is quite lethal right now, and probably the preferred way how I would say I would play firepower now, Hadouken, due to being generally a little bit bored with the whole blighted rounds technomancer scene. So this then plays like a firepower build. You switch on your volcanic rounds and you try to keep them up for as long as possible through a combination of mods. Of course, we are benefiting from the correct choices in the PAX tree that allow us to deal more damage when we shoot for longer. Hadouken! And every once in a while, when we have a few enemies standing around, we feed the flames, which empowers this projectile, this Hadouken. We fire it out, Hadouken, and we just watch the numbers roll in. I think firepower builds are in a great place right now in the game, and this setup capitalizes on both the strengths of a firepower build with its sustainable Hadouken damage that it can deal the whole time, as well as tapping into this projectile that you can shoot that has massive AoE clear potential, but also really good damage against chunky targets. And one of the other things which makes this so good is once you get good at dropping that projectile exactly where you want it to go, you can actually use it to play around the geometry of the map. An example would be like a bunch of enemies being around a corner or behind a cover or something like that. You can actually fire this projectile into the corner or fire it into the sandbags or whatever is in front of it, and it will deal the damage to the enemies around it. Now, there's also the reason why we try to increase the size of this explosion from this projectile as much as possible with mods, because that means that we are actually able to use this to essentially not just shoot it directly at an enemy, but shoot it in amidst a cluster of enemies and have them all take the damage. When we get to the actual build itself, as always, please do ignore my transmog. This is using Scorched Zealot, which is a firepower set for the pyro, but we'll start off with the weapons. We'll look at the armor and the mods on that next. Then we'll talk about the skills and the rotation. And then lastly, we will also look at the class tree. We'll talk about the PAX choices you should be making, and we'll also look at Ascension Points and give you some kind of pointers as which ones you should be targeting first with your first couple of points. Now, when it comes to the weapon itself, I have an absolute zero here that has ultimate freezing bullets on it by default. And this one rolled with Dark Sacrifice, which is fantastic for any firepower build. And then of course I slapped Fortress on here as well, which is just going to further on give me an additional damage increase plus some survivability, which is good because as with fire builds, you are out in the open and you are engaging enemies gun to gun, and a lot of the times that means that you're taking a lot of damage and you're getting shot at as well, and that means that you need to be able to just take a little bit more punch. Now, because this is a firepower build, it doesn't matter which other guns you use, because the idea is that you want to switch on volcanic rounds and then essentially keep it up for as long as possible, so your secondary and your pistol doesn't really matter. Now, one other thing that I'd like to mention is that specifically with the build, I wanted to have access to crit damage, so that's the reason why the absolute zero also works for us here, because it actually has crit damage as one of its substats, which means we can deal more damage if we can land those juicy crit shots. And when it gets to the armor itself and the mods on there, I actually use a torturous mask on the headpiece, and we are trying to get as much bonus firepower as we can with our gear. And then if we can get close range damage or long range damage on there, that's good. Cooldown reduction is also good in certain cases, because that actually means that we have more regular feed the flames and we have more regular ash blast, which is fantastic. And then last but not least, status power can also be good in a way, because it means that your ash status that you apply on enemies lasts for longer. Enemies that are ashed are standing still like a statue, which means you can hit them quite easily. So those things also help. Plus, status is also going to mean that when you set enemies on fire with volcanic rounds, it means that that fire is going to burn for more per tick, basically. So when we look at the mods itself, on the headpiece I have Death Sentence, which is a fantastic debuff mod for Ash Blast. Essentially this means that enemies that are affected by your Ash Blast take more weapon damage and anomaly damage, 40% and 30% respectively, for 5 seconds, which means that once you Ash Blast a group of enemies and then you shoot into them, or you hit them with that melee projectile, it's just going to deal a whole bunch more damage. Now, Flame Grasper is kind of important for us here, and there's a bunch of essential mods essentially for Feed the Flames, which are going to help us to empower the Hadouken Fireball as well. Now, that Fireball, and if we look at quickly just jumping over to the chest piece so we can look at the set bonus of Scorched Zealot. This actually says that the Pyromancer melee skill fires a projectile that explodes upon impact, dealing a certain amount of damage and inflicting ash to enemies within a 5-meter radius. Now, damage of the projectile increases by 25% for each enemy hit with Feed the Flames, up to 100%. So if you are able to feed the flames for enemies, you actually empower that projectile by 100%. This is why it's important for us to try and get our Feed the Flames to hit as many targets as possible, and that's why Flame Grasper on here is good. By default, Feed the Flames hits 1 target, so now with Flame Grasper added on, we hit 3 targets. So that already gets us our 75% increase. And we also have Anomaly Echo on here, because while this is a firepower build, Anomaly Echo gives us firepower and anomaly, and it gives it to us on skill activation for a 6-second duration. We have super low cooldowns on this build, so we're actually able to almost keep this buff up indefinitely. And when we get to the chest, as mentioned, this is our first piece of Scorched Zealot here. We have Brawl on here, which is one of those melee mods that I mentioned in the intro of this video, saying that this boosts our melee skill damage by 100%. This is huge. It's essentially doubling up your damage. Now, we also have Ashen Boost on here, which increases our damage against enemies that are afflicted by ash by 12%. Now, this projectile we shoot makes things ashed. We actually have Ash Blast, which makes things ashed. So there's a whole bunch of ways that enemies can be under this ash status, and that just means you deal more damage to them when they are. Now, I have Susceptibility on here as my Apocalypse mod. This is the one mod on the build that I could potentially change for something else. I just have not managed to get a better piece to drop. But Susceptibility is by no means a shitty mod. This essentially makes that your volcanic rounds decreases the resistance of enemies damaged by volcanic rounds by 30%, which means more damage for you. Now, when it comes to the pants themselves, I have Cauterizing Flames on here. This is a really OP setup for Feed the Flames, which basically says that by default, Feed the Flames heals us as Pyromancers, and when we actually get overhealed by Feed the Flames, this increases our firepower by a percentage, by 1% for 5 seconds, all the way up to 50% based on how much overheal you got. So you can actually empower yourself quite a bit by Feed the Flamesing the enemies, so that's also really good. Our martial arts on here actually reduces the cooldown of our melee, which means we'll be able to fire that fireball out more regularly. So that's absolutely good as well. And then I actually have Shatter on here, which says that I deal 16% more damage against enemies afflicted by freeze. And that kind of just works really well with the Absolute Zero, which has ultimate freezing bullets on it, which freezes enemies every 1 second that I shoot at them. So that's just a little bit of synergy there for some additional firepower damage, or some additional gun damage, if I can put it that way, while I'm shooting and I'm not throwing this fireball out. And when it comes to the hands, I've got Captain Hunt on here. Of course, we generally don't ever have a problem with trash and having to fight them, or you know, like trash enemies. Yeah, but the issue is, you know, captains, elite, bosses, all of that, those are chunkier enemies, and so any amount of additional damage we can deal to them is phenomenal. Now we have wide grip on here, which gives us another target for feed the flames. So now we are at that juicy point of being able to feed the flames for enemies, which gives us that full 100% increase on the fireball. Then I also have bullet kindling on here, which means that we deal 12% more damage against enemies that are burning. Now our volcanic rounds cause enemies to burn, so this is just another nice increase for us to damage. And then last but not least, on our feet here, we have concussive force, which is really good, because not only does it increase the melee skill damage, it also gives us a 50% increase to the radius. And this is good stuff, because this essentially means that you can, this is what I was talking about, when you can fire the fireball into a group of enemies, and you'll actually notice that it covers a massive area with this explosion and dealing the damage to the enemies. Our bullet absorption here is our reload mechanism. So every time when we feed the flames, it replenishes 40% of our ammo in the magazine for every enemy afflicted by the skill. Our feed the flames can affect 4 targets at maximum, so you're always getting, if you're hitting 4 targets, you're actually getting 120% of your ammo back, so you'll get a full mag regardless. Sharp Eye is essentially the only ramp mechanic we have for bullet damage or gun damage, and this says that critical shots will actually, while aiming down sights, will actually increase our firepower by an amount, and this can stack up to 3 times. So this means that once you are actually firing your gun and you're not throwing fireballs out, you can actually deal quite a bit more damage by being more accurate, aiming down sights, and actually hitting those crits. Now when it comes to the skills in the rotation, basically as mentioned, obviously we are using volcanic rounds, and then we've got Ash Blast and Feed the Flames. Now Ash Blast is the way for us to debuff enemies, it's the way for us to control combat and essentially stop enemies from pushing up on us. And Feed the Flames is our reloading mechanism, as well as the way in which we prime those fireballs before we shoot them out. Now by default, if you just use the melee and you just fire out a unpowered fireball, if I can call it that way, you're still going to deal a fair amount of damage. But once you feed the flames, you get 4 targets, it gives you that additional damage. You're really going to start seeing, and I think you saw that in the footage at the beginning of the video, you're going to start seeing some sick serious numbers that this can hit, and that's really the star of this build. And then of course, like I said, you want to have volcanic rounds up, and you want to keep it up, so make sure that you're reloading yourself with Feed the Flames, and that way you can, even if you don't have one of those melees available, you can still deal a fair bit of damage by just shooting at the enemies. Now when it comes to the class tree itself, we of course, and I'm gonna do this quickly and just take my face away here, so we absolutely want to be going top tree, because we want to be accessing as much weapon damage as we can. And so we're going to pick up those nodes, we're going to get ourselves some cooldown reduction on our Feed the Flames and Ash Blast, because those are 2 primary, abilities or skills rather that we are using, except for volcanic rounds. We do want to be getting Assault Master, because we are using an assault rifle, and we're just proceeding all along here. And I'll talk about the top part first, and then we can talk about how we move down. So we go along, we pick up all of the nodes, we get as much weapon damage as we can, we get some resistance piercing as well, and we absolutely go all the way until the end. So we get to burning situation, which means that whenever we use Feed the Flames, whenever we use Ash Blast, we actually give ourselves 45% additional weapon damage. That is why this build doesn't depend on you to kill stuff with the fireball. You deal a fair amount of damage by just shooting at shit, but the fireball is essentially your kill shot, and this is the way how you deal massive amounts of damage to bosses. And this can really shorten your boss kill time by a huge amount. You can absolutely kill bosses by just aiming and shooting down your gun, but you're going to be able to do it 2, 3, maybe 4 times as fast if you mix a couple of fireballs in there. Now at this point, we shoot down here, we grab Incinerate, which is another way for us to put ash onto enemies, because once they start burning, like for instance from you shooting them with volcanic rounds and they haven't died from it, they will actually then also get ash on them and they'll stand still there. We also go all the way down here and we get Extinction, because that's just a way for us to deal additional damage against enemies that are low life. And this is especially good against bosses and stuff, where once you get to that 30% threshold, you're going to start seeing some nice increased damage there. We absolutely want to also just grab Gifted here. We want to grab Magma Golem, because we're trying to get to All Guns Blazing. That says it increases your weapon damage after any skill activation by 20% for 7 seconds. And again, we are constantly using Feed the Flames, we're constantly using Ash Blast, so this is going to give us that nice increase there as well. Now when it gets over to the PAX tree, I think I can bring my mug back, here we go. Then we are obviously going to go top tree, because we want to get to Bullet Frenzy, because this is one of the best ways to ramp up your damage if you are playing Firepower Pyro. So we want to be getting coming in hot, which just helps us deal more damage against enemies at a 80% threshold as well as enemies at a 30% threshold. So this couples pretty well with, I don't know why I just did that, this couples pretty well with extinction and just means that we're going to be dealing a whole bunch of additional damage. Now here you have a choice. When you are starting out with this build and you don't have access to a huge amount of Ascension Points to round out some of the, let's call it hard edges of the build, then you might be struggling a little bit with survivability. Now in this case, Ashen Regalia is great here because this gives us a just flat damage mitigation of 7% for 6 seconds every time you kill a marked target, which basically means an enemy that has been hit by you before, whether you shot at it or hit it with Ash Blast, anything like that. Those are considered marked enemies, and when you kill them, you get a flat damage mitigation of 7% for 6 seconds, and this effect can stack up to 3 times. So this is just a nice 21% damage mitigation across the board, which can definitely help you with some survivability. Now, if survivability is not a problem for you, then you can pick up Ashen Wake, because that's actually going to help you clear faster and help you kill more enemies. Because what this does is it says that your shots damage all enemies afflicted with ash within a 4-meter radius of a target, dealing 30% of the damage dealt. So this is a way for you to cleave damage onto a group of enemies as long as they're all ashed and close to one another, which is generally what this build does to enemies. So good stuff. Hot Streak over here says critical shots increase our weapon damage by 6%. This lasts for 4 seconds and can actually stack up to 5, so you can get up to 30%. And this again is why it is rewarded, while it's not necessary, it is rewarded to actually hit crit shots with this build, which a assault rifle can definitely help you with because they are fairly accurate, because that is actually going to ramp up your damage quite nicely. We do get carbon ammo here, which puts us well over 100 rounds in our magazine, which is fantastic for this build as well, which means you don't have to worry quite that much about, timing yourself right with the Feed the Flames to reload, because generally speaking, you have quite a bunch of bullets in your gun to deal with that situation. Last but not least, as mentioned, we want to get Bullet Frenzy because this says that shots with an assault rifle, or assault weapon, so it could be an LMG if you want to rather use that, or a double gun or a submachine gun, those all can benefit from this. And this says that it increases your weapon damage by 3% per shot, and this effect stacks until you stop shooting. So the longer you hold in your shooting and aim at an enemy, you will actually see your damage just climb and keep going up. So that's why when you are fighting a boss, it's good to not, burst fire like that, but rather get yourself into a position where you can pull off 60, 70, 80 shots in a row before you reload yourself, because you're going to see a massive ramp up as you go from 10 shots to 20 shots to 30 shots to 40 shots. It's just going to grow up quite nicely. Last but not least, as mentioned with the Ascension Point, I have a huge amount of Ascension Points, but generally speaking, what you want to be targeting, your first 10 points should absolutely go into anomaly damage, because that's the flat damage increase across the board. And then from then on, you can absolutely start, putting into close ranged weapon damage. You can put it into weapon damage just by default. You can give yourself a bit more weapon leech there if you want. You can absolutely pick up resistance pierce and armor pierce, and all of these things, they're going to increase your damage profile. They're going to increase the damage that you deal to enemies. Cooldown reduction is fantastic as well if you want to just get access to a little bit, faster, Ash Blast and, Feed the Flames, because Feed the Flames is quite important for this build. You want to be doing that quite often because it's going to heal you, it's going to empower those fireballs, and it's going to give you ammo back. So it's probably the most important skill you have in your repertoire. Now, absolutely, if you want to get a little bit of additional damage here, you can give yourself more crit chance, you can give yourself more crit damage. Also good to pick up if you're looking for mitigation of damage against elites, but also being able to deal more damage against elites. You should absolutely think about getting damage against elites here for more damage, or getting damage mitigation for less damage from those elites. And then what you could also do is, if you are struggling with survivability and you have picked up Ashen Regalia over here and that still hasn't solved your problem, you should probably think about punching some points into health, into armor, possibly into your resistances here, because that will of course also round out any deficiencies your defense might have. And that's going to be it for the build as well as the video. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you made it this far. Let me know if you've messed around with Scorched Zealot, how you would build it, which mods you would change, where you found success with the build, and if you're as impressed as I am with this Hadouken fireball. It deals a shitload of damage if you power it up correctly, and it is just an awesome way to essentially make playing a firepower class, a firepower build, a build that uses volcanic rounds, just a little bit more interesting, a little bit more spicy. I've definitely been having a lot of fun with that. So that's it from me. Again, thank you so much. It's just super important to me that you have a fantastic morning, afternoon, and evening wherever you are in the world. And until next video, fucking cheers.
They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me now, best of me now, best of me now, best of me. They want the best of me.